Now recognizes Representative Friedman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson, for being here today. I represent parts of Los Angeles, which of course was devastated by huge mega fires recently. I'm very appreciative of FEMA's efforts on the ground. What we've discovered is that currently FEMA bars providing assistance to disaster victims who've received individual charitable donations, like through their church or through a GoFundMe page. They're finding that FEMA is deducting that amount. So I introduced a bill, Don't Penalize Victims Act, to ensure that charitable donations are not considered a duplication of benefits by FEMA. You know, people aren't raising money to give it to FEMA. They're raising money to give it to victims to help them rebuild their lives. I would like you to say that you're willing to work with us on this and that you will support these efforts as they move forward.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm your independent political analyst, no spin, no tribalism, just honest, evidence-based breakdowns of what's happening in government. Today, we're diving into a hearing exchange that really highlights a deeper issue with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and how it operates during times of crisis. Representative Laura Friedman of California recently questioned FEMA officials in a congressional hearing. And what unfolded was a surprisingly tense and revealing conversation. Let's break it down.
I would be glad to work you. What I like to say, there should be no politics in emergency management. I would be glad to work with you and glad to look into it.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to continue on some of the questions that have been asked about FEMA's response to the horrific flooding in Texas. And as a mom whose daughter has gone to Girl Scout camp and been up in wild areas, that whole incident really broke my heart. So my heart goes out to everybody in Texas that was affected. The New York Times reported last week that on July 7, 3 days into the emergency response effort, FEMA call centers responded to less than 20% of the calls coming in from disaster victims for help. That means more than 4 out of 5 calls went unanswered. And I can just imagine the frustration of people looking for loved ones, dealing with damage, dealing with incredible tragedy to find out that their government just wasn't answering the phone. Secretary Noem, however, claimed that on Meet the Press that the New York Times piece was, quote, fake news. So I'd like to clear this up for the record. Isn't it accurate that 80% at least of the calls that went to FEMA call centers on July 7th went unanswered?
When the tragedy struck, we knew there would be a
simple yes or no question. They either answered the calls or they didn't answer the calls on July 7th.
When there was a spike in calls, FEMA was there to answer the calls. The majority of the calls were answered at the call centers.
Well, that's not what the report says. The report says that on July 5th, as the floodwaters were starting to recede, FEMA received 3,027 calls from disaster survivors and answered 3,018 of them, which is over 99%. Contractors with 4 call center companies answered the vast majority of the calls. That evening, however, Ms. Noem did not renew the contracts with those 4 companies, and hundreds of contractors were fired, according to the documents and the person briefed on the matter. The next day, July 6th, FEMA received 2,363 calls and answered 846, or roughly 35.8%, according to those documents. And on Monday, July 7th, the agency fielded 16,419 calls and answered 2,613 of them, which is only 15.9%. That's shown by official documents. And FEMA officials were incredibly frustrated by the lapse in those contracts and that it was taking days for Ms. Noem to act. A little while ago, you said that part of your job you felt was to remove, you called them bureaucratic, closing out bureaucratic procedures. To me, having someone, one person only, having to sign off on every contract of $100,000 or more is the definition of bureaucracy. And in this case, it led to thousands of victims not having their calls answered by their government. Their government wasn't there when they reached out for help in their darkest hour. So are those numbers fake? Are you telling me that those are fake numbers, or are they verifiable? And did Ms. Noem misspeak when she said that it was fake news?
What I can tell you is the vast majority of phone calls were answered. There was never a lapse in the contract. Secretary Noem, under her leadership, she's concerned about due diligence and making sure the American people get what they deserve.
So in your
for
mind,
the tax dollars.
15.9% of calls being answered is the vast majority? So is that the benchmark now we're looking for for FEMA to answer their calls, 15%, or in one case, 35% in a day, in the middle of this disaster, this huge disaster?
I would have to agree with Secretary Noem. That's fake news. The majority of the calls were answered. There was never a lapse in contract.
Well, that is absolutely not what the reports from these companies from the disaster says. They give specific numbers of calls that went unanswered, and I don't see how you can deny these reports, but I will yield my time back.
Representative Friedman began by thanking FEMA for its work during the devastating wildfires in her Los Angeles district. But she quickly shifted to a serious concern: FEMA's policy of reducing federal disaster assistance for individuals who received charitable donations, whether through churches, GoFundMe, or other grassroots efforts. Now, this is an important point. People donate money out of compassion, to help others directly. They don't expect that money to reduce government aid. And Friedman rightly introduced the Don't Penalize Victims Act to address this. Frankly, this policy seems outdated. FEMA shouldn't be treating private generosity as a duplication of benefits. So I think she's on solid ground here. Disaster victims shouldn't be punished for receiving help from their communities. Next, Friedman turned to FEMA's handling of the recent Texas floods, which left thousands of families in crisis. And this is where things got especially heated. She cited a New York Times report stating that on July 7th, FEMA received over 16,000 calls from flood victims and answered only 2,600. That's just under 16%. A huge failure in communication at a time when people desperately needed help. And here's where it gets controversial. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, now serving in a key oversight role, called the report fake news. But Friedman pushed back hard, reading FEMA's own call records showing the drop in performance, and citing that hundreds of contracted call center workers were laid off just days before. Let's pause here. Was this a breakdown in logistics, a bureaucratic oversight, or something deeper? From a neutral lens, it seems FEMA didn't have the right infrastructure in place to scale with a sudden call surge. That happens. But the lack of transparency and accountability around that lapse is where the real concern lies. When you're in the middle of a disaster, possibly searching for loved ones, trying to find shelter or food, and you call the government for help, the line better ring on the other end. And if it doesn't, someone needs to own that failure. Friedman then criticized a FEMA policy requiring one person to approve all contracts over $100,000, a rule that likely delayed call center renewals. She called it the definition of bureaucracy, and honestly, she's not wrong. We always hear politicians talk about cutting red tape. Well, here's a clear example where red tape hurt real people in real time. Delays in contract approvals meant no one was there to pick up the phone. Now, FEMA's response was to deny any lapse in service. They claimed the vast majority of calls were answered, which directly contradicts the agency's own numbers. That's where public trust starts to erode. In politics, words matter. If FEMA's leadership continues to gaslight the public and deny obvious facts, it only adds to the narrative that institutions can't be trusted. It doesn't help anyone, not the agency, and certainly not the victims. So here's my take. Representative Friedman made strong data-backed points, both about FEMA's flawed policy on charitable aid and its call center failure during the Texas floods. These aren't partisan attacks, they're questions about competence, accountability, and humanity. FEMA does a lot of good. But no agency is above scrutiny, especially when lives are on the line. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Should charitable donations count against federal aid? Should FEMA overhaul its contracting process? And was this really fake news, or a legitimate wake-up call? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next analysis.